During World War II, some German tanks would have such an impact on history that they are still discussed today, decades later. Some historians say they were cutting-edge technology at the time, light years ahead of anything the Allies had when they appeared on the battlefield. Others argue that they were expensive, over-engineered machines that only brought more problems to the German war effort than actually helping it. However, one thing is certain: they were so unique that we'll probably look back at them with amazement for centuries. Today we're going to tell you everything you didn't know about three most famous German big cats through the story of their crews who witnessed the reality of war firsthand. When World War II broke out, German armor was not yet the monstrosity it would become in just a few short years. Early models, Panzer I-4, were fast, light tanks built for the blitzkrieg tactic. They were armed with machine guns and smaller caliber cannons to support the infantry directly. But soon, everything would drastically change with the introduction of Panzer V and VI. The Tiger. It was December 1943 in Tunisia when the Western Allies first encountered Germany's new tank. During most of the Desert War, British tanks were inferior to Germans, and because of this, British intelligence closely monitored any signs of a new advancements in German tank technology. They heard from the Soviets about a new German tank spotted in September around Leningrad, but they didn't know much about it. When Enigma decrypts revealed that Rommel's forces had received a new tank, the Panzer VI, it came as a surprise even more because the latest German tank at the time was the Panzer IV. However, the Panzer VI, which would turn out to be Tiger, was designed after the Panzer V, the Panther. The Tiger, however, was developed faster because it was based on the already familiar Panzer IV concept, whereas the Panther was built using entirely new technology. Because of this, the Tiger saw action first. Rommel urgently needed reinforcements to cover heavy tank losses in Africa after heavy fighting with increasingly powerful Allied forces. The much-needed arrival of the Tiger came at just the right time. Although Afrika Korps received only around 40 Tigers and German generals scrambled to get them for their units, it was still enough to shock the Allies and earn the tank the fearsome reputation. It is understandable that Allied tank crews, who had up until this point faced Panzer IIs, IIIs and IVs, were horrified when their shells simply bounced off the new German tank, while it destroyed their tanks at any range. The Tiger quickly spread panic among the Allies, who often mistook it for the Panzer IV because of their similar appearance and a constant fear of encountering one. However, despite being lethal against Allied tanks and nearly invulnerable to any anti-tank weapon Allies had at the time, fewer than 40 Tigers across two companies simply couldn't stop the Allied advance. The British 48th Royal Tank Regiment in North Africa unexpectedly captured an almost intact Tiger, giving the Allies much-needed insight into this new German machine. Tiger No. 131, after destroying the lead Churchill tanks of a British armoured column, was hit by another Churchill's 6-pounder. The shell hit the bottom of the Tiger's gun mantlet, ricocheted, went into turret ring and jammed the turret. Next hit wounded the commander and the crew abandoned the tank. It was later recovered and shipped to Britain for examination. By the way, Tiger 131 is the only operational Tiger in the world today. Weighing twice as much as the Panzer IV at 56 tons and equipped with the famous 88mm gun, the Tiger was successfully integrated into a new German military doctrine. Instead of balancing mobility, protection and firepower like earlier tanks, the Tiger sacrificed mobility for superior armor and firepower, as it was intended to spearhead breakthroughs supported by other army sections. So, how was it really in practice? Let's start with armor. The Tiger didn't have sloped armor, with its frontal plate angled at only 10 degrees. Crews were advised to angle the tank and its gun at 45 degrees for better protection when fighting. Although the box-like structure was later replaced by sloped armor to improve protection, the Tiger's design allowed for more internal space. When we say space, it's not meant for the crew, but for more important things like fuel and ammunition. While German crews found the Tiger relatively spacious compared to earlier tanks, Allied tankers described it as cramped, especially for the gunner's position. The Tiger could carry an impressive 92 shells for its 88mm gun. Crews sometimes packed over 100 shells when possible, storing them on the floor, as running out of ammo was a constant fear. The loader took between 6 and 16 seconds to reload, depending on which bin the shells were taken from. Initially, the Tiger's armor provided more than sufficient protection, but as more powerful Allied guns appeared and manganese shortages made German tank armor more brittle and prone to splintering, the Tiger slowly began losing its near-invincible reputation. Soviet forces even learned to disable Tigers using anti-tank rifles, targeting the radiators from the sides. The Tiger's gun and sights made it an exceptionally accurate tank. In British trials, it achieved 5 consecutive hits on a 40 by 45 centimeter target at 1,200 meters. There are even records of a Tiger destroying a T-34 at an incredible range of 3,900 meters. However, as it fired expensive ammunition, it usually engaged at shorter distances to ensure a hit. Apart from the unique challenges Tiger crews faced on the Eastern Front, which we'll discuss in a moment, the major issue was its weight, which caused it numerous problems. The turret alone weighed 11 tons and required a full minute to rotate 360 degrees on hydraulic power. Early in the war, the Germans had no proper way to recover stuck Tigers, and towing them with other tanks was officially forbidden due to risk of damaging the engine and transmission of towing tank. Specialized FAMO vehicles were supposed to recover the Tigers. At least 2 or even 3 of them needed to tow one tank. In practice, however, crews did whatever was necessary to save their tanks. The Tiger's weight also led to frequent mechanical breakdowns. While it was often labeled unreliable, most issues with the transmission and engine were caused by inexperienced and poorly trained drivers, especially under the stress of battle when the tank was pushed beyond its limits. Although the engine had a maximum of 3,000 RPM, drivers were advised not to exceed 2,600. The engine was later limited to 2,600 RPM to reduce mechanical failures, which decreased the Tiger's top speed. Additionally, crossing bridges with the Tiger was like playing Russian roulette. Its hatches were watertight, and it had a snorkel device to cross up to 4 meters deep water by driving over the bottom, which looked scarier than combat itself. When a Tiger broke down and could not be repaired or recovered, it had to be destroyed by its own crew to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. For example, the 508th Heavy Panzer Battalion reported that around 60% of its Tiger losses were due to self-destruction by their crews. During the Normandy campaign, out of 36 Tigers knocked out, 6 were abandoned, 8 were destroyed by Allied armor-piercing rounds, and 20 by their own crews. Despite its very wide all-steel tracks, which are heavier than those on modern Abrams, and Abrams being 20 tons heavier tank, the Tiger encountered unique problems on the Eastern Front. Its complex interleaved and overlapping road wheel arrangement, with 48 road wheels in 3 overlapping rows on each side, was a nightmare in swampy and muddy terrain. Mud, snow, and debris would freeze overnight, completely jamming the tracks. Crews had to clear them before going to sleep and often parked on logs or branches to elevate the tank off the ground. Soviet forces learned this and launched surprise morning attacks before the Germans could get their tanks moving. Additionally, the tracks tended to override the rear sprocket and jam. When this happened, 2 Tigers were needed to tow the immobilized tank, and the tension in the jammed tracks often made it impossible to remove the track pins, so in some cases, they had to be blown apart using explosives. Tigers were organized into special heavy tank battalions, primarily used for spearheading attacks or conducting counterattacks. However, as the tides turned and Germany shifted to a defensive war, Tigers were moved around to plug the gaps in Allied breakthroughs, which accelerated their mechanical wear. The introduction of powerful Soviet 122 and 152mm guns, American 76mm Shermans and tank destroyers, British 17-pounder Fireflies, and heavy tanks like the Pershing and IS-2 made the Tiger significantly more vulnerable by the war's end. Due to its costly and time-consuming production, only 1,347 Tigers were ever built, simply unable to compete against the 40,000 Shermans and 80,000 T-34s produced by the Allies. The Tiger I was twice as expensive as the Panther and 4 times more expensive than the Stug III. However, Tigers were credited with nearly 10,000 enemy tank kills, which is an impressive ratio. Despite its flaws, the Tiger remained a dangerous opponent for Allied tanks until the end of the war. It even knocked out the first Pershing tank in combat. The Tiger II, also called the King Tiger by the Allies, was another attempt by the German military to create a single weapon that could dominate the battlefield. The idea was for it to be heavily protected with enormous firepower, and it certainly had both. However, most of these advantages couldn't be used effectively in the later stage of the war when the tide turned against Germany, and you will see why. Let's first cover the advantages of this tank and then explain why, although it might sound like the best tank of the war, these qualities didn't stop it from being decimated. By 1943, it was clear that the Tiger I was no longer untouchable, and German engineers were already trying to create a better version with improved protection and an enhanced, already famous 88mm gun. However, it was far from an easy task, as thick armor resulted in a vehicle weighing around 70 tons, but powered by the same type of engine used in much lighter tanks like the Panther and Tiger I. They were all powered by variations of the same V12 engine, producing around 700 horsepower. However, the Tiger I was 13 tons lighter, and the Panther even 25 tons lighter than the Tiger II. So, the Tiger II was clearly underpowered. Still, with sloped armor up to 180 millimeters thick in the front, it had serious protection. Its heavy armor gave it an enormous advantage against any tank daring to attack it head-on. Virtually no Allied tank of the war could penetrate its frontal slope. Of all recorded destroyed Tiger IIs by tanks or anti-tank guns, all were knocked out by side or rear shots. The turret was a problem, as its sides and rear were less armored, and ammunition stored there posed a significant danger of exploding if hit. So later, German tankers didn't store ammo in the turret, reducing capacity from 86 to 68 rounds but improving safety. The US and British did not deploy heavy tanks beside a few Pershings, jumbo Shermans, and late Churchill models, so on the Western Front, in tank-on-tank combat, the Tiger II was an unmatched heavyweight. It was also estimated that the frontal armor was impervious to the Soviet 122mm gun, one of the largest tank guns of the war. Soviet tests showed it needed 3 to 4 shots from 500 meters at the front slope so the weld joints would break, as they were of lower quality than those on the Tiger I and Panther. So, for the Allies, the only solution to knock it out with tanks was to outflank it. But the improved 88 on the Tiger II could destroy almost any Allied tank of the time at ranges over 2,500 meters, so good luck outmaneuvering it. However, the thick armor and long gun worked against the Tiger II in urban combat, where it got stuck in narrow city streets, couldn't rotate its gun effectively, and was easily outflanked by Allied tanks or infantry with anti-tank weapons. The 88mm Pak 43 L71 gun, mounted on both the Tiger II and the Jagdpanther, was a significant improvement over the already famous 88 used in the Tiger I. Although the same caliber, this new gun had an extremely high muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second thanks to its longer barrel and larger cartridge with more propellant. While it fired the same projectiles, armor penetration was drastically increased. Here is a brief comparison to help you understand. The Tiger I's 88 could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor sloped at 60 degrees at 100 meters, enough to make it feared by all Allied tank crews throughout the war. Under the same conditions, the 88 in the Tiger II could penetrate 202 millimeters of armor, but the major difference shows at long range. At 2,000 meters, the Tiger I's penetration dropped to 84, while the Tiger II punched through 132 millimeters. Simply put, the 88 in the Tiger II could penetrate more armor at 2,000 meters than the older 88 could at just 100 meters. So, their guns could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where they effectively couldn't do anything. Also, the Germans had much better optics than the Allies, adding to their deadly reputation at long distances. With that being said, this is definitely the best tank of the time that helped Germany win the war? Well, no. Although it had all these capabilities, it suffered tremendously from a combination of technical, logistical, and strategic factors. We already mentioned they were too heavy, even by today's standards, let alone in World War II. The engine was extremely underpowered for such weight, and the transmission and steering were not made to withstand it. Each bridge crossing was a gamble, and bridge reinforcement units had to travel with them. It wasn't rare to see a Tiger II destroy the bridge and fall into the river. Another issue was that the availability rate was around 40%. This means after transport and preparation for action, out of 10 tanks, only 4 would be operational. The suspension system, although giving it a smoother ride and stability to fire on the move, was a complete nightmare for maintenance. Mud and debris got jammed between overlapping wheels, and in winter it would freeze and completely disable the tank. They broke down quite often in normal conditions, let alone in combat. Now, when you combine that with poor logistics, a lack of spare parts and shortages of fuel and ammunition, you get that more Tiger IIs were destroyed by their own crews than by the enemy. They would either break down, run out of fuel or ammunition, and if the crew couldn't put it back into action, they had to blow it up or burn the tank so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands and be used against them. They were costly to produce and essentially handmade and individually fitted. That created a nightmare for mass production and even more trouble for mechanics in the field. Due to its weight, wider tracks had to be used, making it hard to transport by train, which was the main transport method at the time. For this reason, narrow transport tracks were mounted to load and unload tanks from trains, then had to be replaced with wider field tracks by their crews. All these things made it very difficult just to put them into combat on the front, where they were now encountering much stronger Allied forces on all fronts. In addition to that, the Allied bombing campaign severely disrupted factories and fuel production. In the fall of 1944, one of the major tank factories was almost completely destroyed by a bombing raid, halting the production of around 600 Tiger IIs. Also, manganese was in short supply, and all late-war German tanks suffered from lower quality armor, more prone to cracking and splintering, sometimes with entire armor plates collapsing after being hit. Because of this, only about 500 Tiger IIs were ever built, meaning they were almost always outnumbered 10-1. And when the Allies gained air superiority, they were easy targets for fighter bombers armed with rockets like the Thunderbolt or Hawker Typhoon. But here is the thing. Despite all these problems, the highly experienced, battle-hardened crews who had mostly transferred from earlier tanks and now received these new machines would achieve a terrifying kill-to-loss ratio. The 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, during its 166 days of operation in the Hungarian theatre, destroyed 121 Soviet tanks, 244 anti-tank guns, 5 aircraft, and a train. On the other hand, they lost 25 Tiger IIs, 13 of which were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. So, when properly supported and used, they were killing machines for enemy armor. The opposite example is the Battle of the Bulge, where around 150 Tiger IIs were deployed and almost all were lost in the offensive, mostly due to fuel and ammunition shortages. Kurt Knispel is an example of how effective the Tiger II could be in the right hands. Throughout his career as a gunner and then commander from Panzer IV, then Tiger I and later Tiger II, he accumulated 168 confirmed armored vehicle kills, though it's believed the real number is higher. He was killed in action in 1945 in his Tiger II, attempting to halt the Soviet advance. Another interesting example is when a Tiger II during the Ardennes offensive was ambushed by a small M8 Greyhound light armored car. Concealed beside the road, the M8 saw the Tiger rolling by. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the M8, armed with just a 37mm gun that couldn't penetrate the Tiger II's heavy armor from the front or sides, aimed for its rear. They let the Tiger pass and then sprinted towards the road to close the distance and ambush it. They were spotted, and the big 88 started traversing towards them. Before the turret could rotate and put the M8 in its sights, the armored car was already directly behind it at just 25 yards and immediately opened fire from its cannon. It put 3 rounds in rapid succession into the rear of the Tiger II, and finally the engine burst into flames, soon followed by the turret as well. Here you see that there are no rules, and an armored car with absolutely no chance on paper managed to destroy a superior Tiger II. On the other hand, despite being completely surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of fuel and ammo, the last operational Tiger IIs made a horrific last stand in Berlin. They positioned themselves in strategic choke points and caused tremendous damage to Soviet armor trying to break into the city, easily destroying even heavy IS-2 tanks. So, as you see, it's often not the tank itself, but everything else around it that matters. The Soviets and the US used their much less protected and armed T-34s and Shermans, but with good logistics support and in great supply. 500 Tiger IIs, poorly equipped and supported, although with an estimated 3 Allied tanks destroyed per knocked-out Tiger, couldn't make a dent in the Allied offensive, let alone stop it and turn the tide of the war. When you measure the Panther's frontal armor, powerful engine, and the armor penetration of its gun, you could say that it is a very capable tank. However, when you combine all its characteristics and factors, it turns out to be a tank that failed to fulfill its military purpose of actually being a tank. Was this big cat nowhere near what it is represented to be? It is said that the Panther came as a direct response to Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks, but it was actually already in development, and the appearance of these Soviet tanks only hurried the process. And when we say hurried, we mean it went from the drawing board into production in record time, without nearly as much testing as other tanks received. That was because when the T-34 and KV-1 emerged on the battlefield, they completely outclassed early German tanks, scaring the life out of their tankers who threw everything they had at them, only to see their shells bounce off the Soviet armor. German Panzer IIs and IIIs with their short-barreled, small-caliber guns couldn't do anything against new Soviet armor. Before the Panzer IV was upgraded with the 75mm gun, the only effective German anti-tank weapon was the 88mm flak cannon, which was in scarce supply. So this understandably made them want a new tank as soon as possible. The new tank we're talking about was a completely different design from the familiar Panzer IV and Tiger I concept. The Panther was intended to be a highly mobile medium tank but significantly better protected and armed than the Panzer IV, which it was meant to replace. Through rushed and incomplete testing, and with the impending Battle of Kursk, the Panther was deemed good enough, loaded onto trains, and sent to the Eastern Front. To make matters worse, Panther crews were initially trained on Panzer IVs before switching to the new tank. They only got familiar with the Panther rather than actually being trained. Only a few live fire exercises were held, and taking photos or writing notes was strictly forbidden because the Panther was a top-secret new technology. Nevertheless, the first Panthers arrived at the Eastern Front, and the first losses occurred even before the battle. 2 engines caught fire during unloading from the train and burned down both tanks, while many more broke down on their way from the railway station to the front lines. The first combat the Panther saw was during Operation Citadel, the massive German armoured assault on heavily entrenched Soviet positions, which marked the beginning of the Battle of Kursk. On their first day, Panthers driving towards Soviet positions came across a wide and deep anti-tank ditch filled with water. More experienced crews went another way to avoid it, while others, due to a misunderstanding in communication, attempted to cross it. They hit anti-tank mines and got stuck in the mud, disabling whole 2 companies of Panthers. Then, pre-sighted Soviet artillery started raining down on them. A little later, Panthers would encounter enemy tanks for the first time, and it wasn't a T-34 or a KV-1, but ironically, M3 Lees. US Lees, supplied through the Lend-Lease program, had their day quickly ruined, as they were simply no match for the Panther. After 6 of them were destroyed, they retreated. However, it wasn't a great day for the Panthers either. On their first day of combat, 18 Panthers were lost. On the second day, 37 more were knocked out, one of them destroyed by a Panzer IV that mistook it for an enemy tank in the chaos of battle. By the end of the operation, over 200 Panthers were knocked out, around 130 of which were put out of action due to mechanical breakdowns. Problems. So why did what was supposed to be the best tank of the war fail to fulfill nearly all of its expectations? First, let's start with the fact that the Panther's sides could be penetrated by the Soviet 14.5mm anti-tank rifle. The upper sides of the hull were just 40mm thick and sloped at 40 degrees, while the lower part wasn't sloped. Side skirts were added to cover the gap between the upper hull and road wheels, protecting it from anti-tank rifles, but the Panther was still highly vulnerable to side attacks. Hitler himself ordered that the tank's protection be focused on the front. Because of this, the front plate was 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, giving the Panther significant protection from direct hits. The turret had 100mm of armor sloped at 10 degrees, which was respectable. However, with the front plate now much heavier, the tank became front-heavy and unbalanced, contributing to an enormous number of mechanical breakdowns. We can confidently say that the Panther was a notoriously unreliable tank. In the first versions, there were even signs of sabotage. Various screws and pieces of metal were found in fuel tanks and transmissions. Perhaps prisoners or workers in German factories tried to damage the Germans as much as they could. The biggest problem with the Panther that was never resolved was its final drive. It was designed and tested for vehicles up to 30 tons, but was then used in tanks over 50 tons. It was notoriously fragile and made from inadequate materials, giving it a lifespan of just 150 kilometers on average. To get a better idea of how bad this was, the Panther had a fuel range of 260 kilometers, meaning you would usually break your final drive before needing to refuel. The final drive was the part that transmitted engine power to the drive wheels and then to the tracks. So when it failed, the tank was immobilized, and replacing it in the field was far from quick and simple. Experienced drivers could make it last a little longer, but try being careful with your clutch when someone is shooting at you. The second major issue was engines prone to catching fire, which actually took out a lot of Panthers. The fuel mixture wouldn't always completely combust, and unburned fuel would end up in the exhaust system. Since the exhaust was already hot, the fuel could explode or create a fireball. This would then spread to electrical wires, and if not put out immediately, the whole tank would catch fire. In early versions, there was also an issue with flames shooting out of the exhaust pipes, which could reveal a Panther's position from miles away at night. The same engine worked quite well in other German heavy tanks, but in the Panther it would quickly overheat at high RPMs due to its poor cooling system. If the tank broke down during battle and couldn't be recovered, crews had to abandon and destroy it to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. That was the fate of about 60% of immobilized Panthers. The Panther was intended to serve in medium tank companies, unlike the Tiger, which was a heavy breakthrough tank. But with a combat weight of 45 tons, it was more of a heavy tank than a medium. The Germans called the IS-2 a super heavy tank, even though it weighed the same as the Panther. The V12 Maybach petrol engine put out about 700 horsepower, giving the Panther better mobility than the much lighter T-34 and Sherman, at least on paper. The same suspension used in other German heavy tanks had its own set of problems, though this wasn't the Panther's fault. The overlapping road wheels provided better traction and a more stable ride, but they were a nightmare in the field, especially on the eastern front. Mud and debris would get lodged between the wheels and freeze, completely immobilizing the tank. Crews had to clean them daily and park on branches to avoid getting stuck overnight. The Soviets knew this and launched surprise morning attacks before German crews could get their tanks moving. The Panther's combat availability was a catastrophic 50%, meaning that out of 10 Panthers, only 5 could actually start up and be sent into battle, hoping they wouldn't break down on the way, and that was even under normal conditions. Okay, so now let's say something positive. The Panther's 75mm gun was considered the best anti-tank gun the Germans had. The barrel was over 5 meters long, and the rounds were of high quality, with a large propellant charge giving it an extreme muzzle velocity of 935 meters per second. The rate of fire was 6 rounds per minute, and it could fire 2 types of armor-piercing shells and 1 type of high explosive. With better AP rounds, it could penetrate up to 150 millimeters of armor sloped at 30 degrees from 1 kilometer away, more than enough to destroy almost any Allied tank. One problem with the ammunition storage was that in some variants, 52 shells were stored in a single place in the side sponson, so if hit in that area, it wouldn't be a great day for the Panther and its crew. The Panther saw most of its action fighting Soviet armor, but around 400 were transferred to the Western Front after the invasion of Normandy to counter British and American tanks. There, the Panthers engaged in heavy fighting against Churchills and Shermans, with the Sherman Firefly being the biggest threat to them. The Panther was at a serious disadvantage in Normandy's bocage terrain and small villages due to its long barrel and wide hull. Close quarters battles didn't suit the Panther, which was designed for long-range, open-field combat like on the Eastern Front. In tight terrain, it was easily outflanked by Shermans, which didn't have this problem. When the Battle of the Bulge began, 5 Panthers were used in a daring deception operation to sneak behind Allied lines disguised as American M10 tank destroyers. The Germans got the idea to weld plates to modify their appearance, paint them in US camouflage and markings, and then drive into the American rear. Unfortunately for the Germans, someone became suspicious of these odd-looking M10s, and all 5 were destroyed. The Panther's turret was also used in fortified defensive positions along the Atlantic Wall and the Siegfried Line. These fortifications had a reinforced concrete fighting compartment buried in the ground, with an up-armored Panther turret and cannon on top, and they were quite difficult to destroy. So, was the Panther a costly mistake for the Germans? For the price of 5 Panthers, the Germans could build 6 Panzer IVs. While this doesn't sound like much of a difference, when you look at the almost 6,000 Panthers produced, they could have had over 7,000 Panzer IVs instead. The Panzer IV was reliable, had most of its issues corrected, and with over 2 years of combat experience, crews were already familiar with it. It was more than capable of dealing with Shermans and T-34s, and with its improved 75mm gun, it was dangerous to almost all Allied tanks. However, we'll never know what it could have been. But then, we wouldn't have the Panther to fight over in YouTube comments about how good it really was.